The arrangements were announced on a Thursday morning, read aloud by Mr. Croyd, in the servants' hall with the careful precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and wished to appear as though he did not. It was a list of household changes, penned in the steward's own meticulous hand. New schedules for the kitchen staff, a revised rota for the silver service, and then, set apart from the domestic minutiae by a deliberate pause in Croyd's reading, the final item. The Dowager Duchess, Lady Sabine Voss, would be returning to Thornfield Park on a permanent basis. She would henceforth assume direct oversight of all household affairs, including menus, staff appointments, entertaining, and the family's social correspondence. No one in the servants' hall spoke. No one looked at one another. They did not need to. Every person standing in that cold, stone-flagged room understood what the words meant. The Duchess, their Duchess, had just been relieved of the last thread of authority in her own home. Evelina was not present to hear it. She learned of the changes the way she had learned of most things that concerned her over the past 3 years, not from her husband, but second-hand, through the quiet, stricken voice of her lady's maid, Bridget, who found her in the glass-house tending the orchids that no one else in the household remembered existed. "Your Grace," Bridget had begun, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "There has been an announcement." Evelina's hands did not still on the clay pot. She continued, pressing the dark soil around the base of the stem, her movements unhurried, methodical, practiced. She did not ask what announcement. She had felt it coming for weeks, the way a storm announces itself before the first drop of rain. A shift in pressure, a darkening along the edge of the sky that most people ignore because the sun is still visible overhead. "Tell me," she said. Bridget told her. Evelina listened. When Bridget had finished, she brushed the soil from her fingers and straightened. Her face was composed, her expression the same mild, unreadable calm that the household had come to associate with her. It was the face she had perfected over 3 years of a marriage, that had begun with hope and had slowly, methodically, been reduced to something far lonelier and far more solitary than hope. "Thank you, Bridget," she said. "That will be all for now." Bridget hesitated, her eyes bright with unshed tears of outrage on her mistress's behalf, but Evelina had already turned back to the orchids, and the dismissal, gentle as it was absolute. Thornfield Park stood at the northern edge of the county, a vast and ancient house of gray stone and black slate that had been the seat of the Voss family for more than 200 years. It was a place built for endurance, not for warmth. Its corridors were long and shadowed, its rooms tall and austere, its windows narrow enough to have once repelled arrows. The moors pressed close on 3 sides, and on the 4th, a lake of such perfect stillness that it reflected the sky like a wound. Hadrian Voss, the 7th Duke of Thornfield, had inherited the house, the title, and the temperament of his forebears. He was a man of sharp intelligence and formidable will, tall and spare, with a face that seemed to have been designed for authority rather than affection, dark hair, worn shorter than fashion permitted, eyes the color of a winter lake, pale and difficult to read, a jaw that could have been cut from the same gray stone as his ancestral walls. He had married Evelina Hartwell 3 years ago, and the county had called it a love match. She had been the daughter of a respected country physician, beautiful in a quiet, unconventional way, with auburn hair and steady gray-green eyes that saw more than they revealed. She had no title, no fortune, no grand connections. What she had was a mind that could hold its own with his, a warmth that had drawn him in like a fire on a January night, and a composure that he had mistaken for limitless patience. Perhaps that was the foundation of every disaster that followed. He believed her patience was infinite. He believed, as a man who has never been denied anything of consequence will believe, that grace extended to him once would be extended to him forever. That forgiveness, once given, was a standing offer. He was wrong, but he did not know that yet. Lady Sabine Voss arrived at Thornfield Park 3 days after the announcement, in a black lacquered carriage drawn by 4 matched greys. She swept into the entrance hall as though she had never left it, which, in a sense, she had not. Although she had resided at the dower house in the village since Hadrian's marriage, her presence had never truly departed Thornfield. Her instructions still arrived by daily letter. Her preferences were still consulted on matters of linen and wine and the seasonal arrangement of the formal rooms. Mr. Croyd, the steward, she had appointed 15 years ago, still answered to her before he answered to anyone else, including his nominal master. She was a tall woman, angular and immaculate, with silver hair swept back from a face that had once been handsome and was now simply commanding. She wore mourning colors perpetually, though her husband had been dead for 9 years, and the effect was deliberate. It clothed her in a permanent authority, a visual reminder that she was the widow of the 6th Duke, the mother of the 7th, and in her own estimation, the true custodian of the Voss legacy. She had never forgiven her son for marrying beneath him. She had never said so in those precise words. She was far too clever for that. What she had done over 3 patient and relentless years was to make Evelina feel it. A raised eyebrow at a dinner Evelina had planned, a quiet correction of her French in front of guests, a letter to Hadrian suggesting, ever so gently, that certain decisions regarding the household might benefit from a more experienced hand. The campaign had been exquisite in its restraint, death by 1,000 courtesies. And Hadrian, absorbed in the politics of the county, in the management of his vast estate, in the restless driving ambition that left room for little else, had not seen it. Or more precisely, he had seen it and had chosen the path of least resistance, which was to agree with his mother, soothe his wife, and assume that the equilibrium would hold. "She will come round," he had said to Croyd once, when the steward had delicately raised the question of conflicting instructions from the Duchess and the Dowager. "She always does." It was the phrase he used, the easy, careless phrase of a man who had never had to fight to be heard. "She always does." Evelina had heard those words, or versions of them, carried to her on the reliable current of household gossip. She had absorbed them the way she absorbed everything, with a stillness that people mistook for acceptance. Lady Sabine's permanent return changed the architecture of daily life at Thornfield within hours of her arrival. Menus that Evelina had planned for the week were revised without consultation. Flowers she had arranged in the morning room were replaced by the afternoon. The seating in the small dining room was rearranged so that Sabine occupied the chair at the foot of the table, the traditional seat of the lady of the house. These were not oversights, they were messages, delivered with surgical accuracy. The staff adjusted instantly. They were practical people, and they understood power. The Duchess was kind, but kindness had no currency in a house governed by the Dowager's iron will. Within days they were directing their questions to Lady Sabine. They were seeking her approval. They were looking past Evelina, as though she had become part of the furniture, a fading presence in a pale gown who drifted through rooms that no longer answered to her. Only Bridget remained firmly, stubbornly loyal, and one other. Her name was Lark. She was 7 years old, small even for her age, with a narrow, serious face and dark eyes that held the particular watchfulness of a child who has learned early that the world is not a safe place. She had arrived at Thornfield 6 months ago, carried in on a tide of rain and misfortune that had left her with nothing but the clothes she wore, and a silence so complete it frightened the household staff. Her father had been a tenant farmer on the Thornfield estate. Her mother had died at her birth. The father had managed alone for 7 years, with a grim, steady competence, until a fever took him in the space of 3 days, leaving the child standing in the doorway of a cold cottage, with no family, no money, and not a single living relative who could be traced. Mr. Croyd had recommended the parish workhouse. It was the appropriate solution, he had said. his pen already drafting the necessary correspondence. The estate bore no formal obligation to the children of deceased tenants. It was unfortunate, certainly, but these things happened, and sentiment had no place in the administration of a property of this size. Evelina had overruled him. It was one of the last acts of authority she had exercised before Lady Sabine's return, and it had cost her dearly. Hadrian, presented with the situation over dinner, had shrugged and deferred to Croyd's judgment. "Pah! The child is not our responsibility," he had said, not unkindly, but with the brisk finality of a man who had already moved on to the next item in his mind. Evelina had not argued. She never argued. She had simply gone to the cottage herself the next morning, wrapped the child in a woolen blanket, and brought her back to Thornfield. She had installed her in a small room near the kitchens arranged for the cook to feed her, and informed Croyd in a voice that permitted no discussion that the child would remain until a proper home could be found for her. A proper home was never found because Evelina carefully ensured that no one looked very hard. Lark did not speak. She had not spoken a single word since her father's death. The village doctor called it a nervous condition and said she might grow out of it. Mrs. Penrose, the cook, called it stubbornness. The footman called it eerie. The housemaids who were young and superstitious crossed themselves when she passed, and whispered that a silent child was a cursed child, a changeling left behind by something that had taken the real girl. Lady Sabine, upon her arrival, had taken one look at Lark and pronounced her a stray, the word carrying the full weight of her contempt. "She will go to the parish before the month is out," she had told Croyd, within earshot of 3 housemaids who carried the message to every corner of the house within the hour. "I will not have vagrants cluttering the servants' quarters." But Lark was still at Thornfield, because Evelina, in her careful and increasingly invisible way, had made it so. She did not confront Lady Sabine on the matter. She did not appeal to Hadrian. She simply ensured that the child was always just beyond the dowager's direct line of sight, tucked away in corners of the house that Sabine did not frequent, fed and clothed and looked after with a care that was all the more fierce for being conducted in secret. And Lark, who would not speak to a living soul, who sat rigid and mute when addressed by the cook, who shrank from the housemaids and hid from the footman, who turned her face to the wall when Mr. Croyd attempted to question her, followed Evelina, not loudly, not with the demanding insistence of a normal child, but with the same steady, constant gravity that draws a leaf downstream. If Evelina was in the glass house, Lark was there, sitting cross-legged among the clay pots, her dark eyes following Evelina's hands as they worked the soil. If Evelina walked the gravel paths of the formal garden, Lark was 3 steps behind her, her small shoes making almost no sound. If Evelina sat in the window seat of the morning room to read in the thin afternoon light, Lark would appear in the doorway, hover for a moment like a question, and then come to sit on the floor at her feet, not touching, not speaking, but present, always present. It was not a child's attachment. It was something older and more solemn than that. It was the quiet, absolute trust of a creature who has identified the one safe harbor in a hostile world and intends never to let it out of sight. The household found it unsettling. Bridget found it heartbreaking. Evelina found it the only thing that still made her feel real. She did not speak of this. She did not speak of many things. At night, when the house was silent and Hadrian was either absent or asleep in his separate chamber, a distance he had established a year ago with a vague reference to his early mornings and restless habits, Evelina would sometimes go to Lark's small room near the kitchens. She would sit on the edge of the narrow cot and brush the girl's dark hair back from her forehead, and Lark would reach up and press her palm flat against Evelina's cheek. It was their ritual, a conversation without language, a bond that needed no words because words had failed them both. "You are safe," Evelina would whisper into the warm darkness. "You are not alone." She was speaking to the child. She was also speaking to herself. What the household did not know, what Hadrian did not know, What Lady Sabine, with all her shrewd observation and her network of loyal informants, had never once suspected was that Evelina Voss was the only thing standing between Thornfield Park and absolute ruin. She had discovered the truth 14 months ago. It had begun with a discrepancy, a single figure in the quarterly accounts that Croyd had left on Hadrian's desk, a desk Hadrian rarely examined with any real care because he trusted his steward the way he trusted the walls of his house, as permanent, as load-bearing, as beyond question. Evelina, who had been trained in the practical mathematics of household management by her physician father, a man who believed his daughter should understand the language of numbers as fluently as the language of books, had noticed it while placing a cup of tea on the desk one afternoon. A single figure, a column that did not balance. She might have said something then. She might have pointed to the ledger and said, "Hadrian, this sum is wrong." But she had learned, by that point in her marriage, that pointing out problems to her husband was received not as helpfulness, but as criticism. Lady Sabine had taught him that, or perhaps he had always believed it, and Sabine had simply given him permission to act on the belief. Either way, Evelina had said nothing. She had gone back to the study that evening, alone, and she had looked more closely. What she found turned her blood to ice. The discrepancy was not an error. It was a pattern. A careful, methodical siphoning of funds from the estate accounts into a series of private expenditures that bore no relation to the running of Thornfield. False invoices for building materials that had never been delivered. Payments to tradesmen who did not exist. Rents collected from tenants and only partially recorded in the master ledger. Mr. Croyd was stealing from them. He had been stealing from them for years. The sums were not vast individually, but accumulated over a decade and a half of patient invisible theft. They amounted to a catastrophe. The estate, which Hadrian believed to be solvent and thriving, was in fact bleeding money. Debts had been steadily mounting. Creditors in the county had begun to murmur. The tenant farms, starved of the investment that the account books claimed they were receiving, were falling into disrepair. Thornfield was dying, and its master did not know. Evelina's first instinct had been to tell Hadrian. She had rehearsed the conversation in her mind a dozen times, standing before the mirror in her dressing room, her hands steady, her voice calm, her arguments marshaled with the precision her father had taught her. But then, she had imagined his response, not the response of the man she had married, the man who had once sat with her until dawn discussing philosophy and poetry, the man whose rare smile had made her feel as though she had been handed the keys to a locked room. That man had receded so far behind the Duke that she could barely remember his face. The response would come from the Duke. It would be disbelief first, because Croyd was his mother's appointment, his mother's man, and to question Croyd was to question Sabine. Then irritation, because she was meddling in matters that were not her concern. And then, worst of all, the dismissal she had come to dread, the cool, measured turning away that told her the conversation was over before it had begun. She will come round. She always does. So Evelina had done the only thing she could. She had taken the problem upon herself. Over 14 months, working in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the house slept, she had constructed a shadow set of accounts. She had tracked every false invoice, every phantom tradesman, every penny that Croyd had diverted. She kept the evidence in a locked writing case hidden beneath a false bottom in her wardrobe, the same case her father had given her on her 14th birthday, the year he had taught her double-entry bookkeeping while other girls were learning embroidery. And then she had begun to repair the damage. She started with her jewelry. The sapphire earrings that had been Hadrian's wedding gift, sold discreetly through an agent in the city and replaced with paste copies so fine that no one noticed the difference, the pearl choker, the garnet brooch, the diamond and ruby set Hadrian had given her for their first anniversary. The last gift he had chosen for her himself before the choosing of gifts was delegated to Bridget. Piece by piece, the jewels had gone. Piece by piece, the debts had been paid. When the jewelry ran out, she turned to her dowry. The modest but not insignificant sum her father had set aside for her, money that was legally hers, but practically invisible to a husband who had never inquired about its existence. She had written to the creditors herself, not as the Duchess of Thornfield, but as a private agent acting on behalf of the estate. She had negotiated reduced settlements. She had arranged extended terms. She had, with a quiet and ferocious ingenuity that would have astonished anyone who thought they knew her, held the wolves at bay. No one knew. Not Bridget, who would have been horrified. Not Hadrian, who would not have believed it. Not Lady Sabine, who would have used the information as a weapon. And certainly not Mr. Croyd, who continued his careful predation in blissful ignorance, unaware that the woman he dismissed as a decorative irrelevance was dismantling his work transaction by transaction. Evelina kept the shadow accounts in the writing case. She kept the receipts from the jewelers. She kept copies of every letter she had sent and every reply she had received. She kept, in short, a complete and meticulous record of both the crime and the cure. It was exhausting. It was lonely. It was slowly consuming her from the inside. And it was entirely invisible to the man who slept 30 feet away, separated by a locked connecting door, and a silence that had grown so vast it had become a kind of landscape, a frozen waste between two people who had once known how to reach each other and had somewhere along the way forgotten the path. The worst part was not the work. It was not the secrecy or the fear or the relentless arithmetic of debt and repayment that haunted her waking hours. The worst part was that she was saving his house, his name, his legacy, and he would never think to ask her how she spent her nights. The days that followed Lady Sabine's return moved with the slow inevitability of a tide coming in. Each morning brought some new small erasure of Evelina's presence in the house. The writing desk in the morning room, the one Evelina had used for her personal correspondence, was moved to Lady Sabine's private sitting room without explanation. The household ledger, which Evelina had maintained since her arrival at Thornfield, was removed from the drawer where she kept it and placed in Croyd's office behind a door that was now kept locked. The weekly meeting with Mrs. Penrose about menus and provisions, one of the few rituals that had still felt like hers, was reassigned to Lady Sabine directly. Each change was small, each was deniable, and each cut a little deeper. The staff, sensing the shift in power with the unerring instinct of people whose livelihoods depend on reading the weather correctly, adjusted their behavior accordingly. Evelina's requests were met with a fractional hesitation, a barely perceptible pause that said, louder than any words could, "Let me check with the Dowager first." Her instructions about Lark's meals were sometimes forgotten. Her preference for fresh flowers in the upper corridors was discreetly discontinued. She was becoming a ghost in her own home, present but unacknowledged, visible but unseen. Croyd, emboldened by his patron's return, dropped even the pretense of deference. He no longer stood when Evelina entered a room. He addressed her as ma'am, rather than your grace, a subtle demotion that anyone attuned to the language of service would have recognized instantly. When she asked about the quarterly accounts one afternoon, a careful, seemingly casual inquiry designed to check whether he had altered his methods since she had last examined the ledgers, he had looked at her with an expression of mild, polished condescension and said, "Those matters are well in hand, ma'am. His Grace is fully informed. I would not wish to burden you with figures. It was a wall. Smooth, courteous, and impenetrable. Her midnight work was now nearly impossible." The study where she had previously conducted her shadow accounting was locked each evening by Croyd himself, the key kept on his person. The ledgers she needed to cross-reference against her own records were behind that locked door. She was working from memory now, and memory, however disciplined, was not the same as evidence. And then Lady Sabine found Lark. It happened on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Evelina had settled the child in a small alcove off the boot room, a forgotten corner of the house where Lark liked to sit with a piece of chalk and the slate that Evelina had given her. She drew on it constantly, elaborate, wordless pictures of trees and horses and the cottage where she had once lived. It was her language, the only one she had left. Lady Sabine, conducting what she called an inspection of the household's efficiency, swept through the service corridors with Croyd at her heels. She rounded the corner and found the child sitting cross-legged on the flagstones, her chalk moving in careful, absorbed circles. The dowager stopped. Her gaze traveled from the child to the slate to the small, clean dress that Evelina had altered from one of her own old garments. "What is this?" she said. Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. Croyd stepped forward. "The child I mentioned, my lady, the tenant's daughter." Her Grace insisted she remain. Insisted. Lady Sabine repeated the word as though tasting something unpleasant. She looked down at Lark. The child had gone very still, her chalk frozen against the slate, her dark eyes wide and fixed on the tall woman above her with the absolute stillness of a small animal caught in open ground. "This is not a foundling hospital," the dowager said. She turned to Croyd. "The girl goes to the parish by week's end. See to it personally." She left without waiting for a response. She did not look back. Lark did not move for a long time after she was gone. When Evelina found her an hour later, the child was in exactly the same position, her chalk still pressed to the slate. But she had drawn nothing. The slate was blank. And for the first time since she had come to Thornfield, Lark was not watching the door, waiting for Evelina to appear. She was staring at the wall, her small face closed and empty, as though something behind it had softly shut down. Evelina knelt beside her. She did not speak. She gathered the child into her arms, and Lark pressed her face against Evelina's shoulder. And though no sound came from her, Evelina could feel the small body shaking with the force of tears that had no voice. "I will not let them take you," Evelina whispered. "I promise you. I promise." It was a promise she had no power to keep, and she knew it. That night, unable to sleep, Evelina sat on the floor of her dressing room, her back against the wardrobe, the locked writing case on her lap. She ran her fingers over the brass clasp. 14 months of evidence. 14 months of numbers and receipts and carefully copied letters. All of it useless if she could no longer access the study. All of it meaningless if she was dismissed from the house before she could present it to anyone who would listen. She was running out of time. She was running out of money. And the one person who should have been her ally, her partner, her protector, was asleep on the other side of a wall and a locked door, dreaming of nothing that concerned her. The dinner was Lady Sabine's idea. A gathering of the county's most prominent families, ostensibly to celebrate the dowager's return to Thornfield, but in truth a stage upon which the new order of the household would be made visible to the world beyond its walls. The invitations were sent in Lady Sabine's name. The menu was chosen by Lady Sabine. The seating was arranged by Lady Sabine, with Evelina placed not at the foot of the table, as was her right, but in the middle, flanked by the wife of a minor landowner on one side and the elderly, half-deaf rector on the other. It was the seat of a guest, not a hostess. A woman tolerated, not honored. Evelina dressed for the evening with the same deliberate calm she brought to everything. Bridget helped her into a gown of deep blue silk, one of the few remaining garments from her trousseau that had not been discreetly sold or allowed to grow unfashionable. As Bridget fastened the clasp of the necklace at her throat, Evelina caught a glimpse of the stones in the mirror. Paste! The sapphires that Hadrian had given her on their wedding night, long since sold and replaced with glass that sparkled convincingly under candlelight but felt weightless against her skin. She touched them briefly. Then she dropped her hand and went downstairs. The dinner proceeded exactly as Lady Sabine had designed it. The dowager presided from the head of the table, resplendent in black velvet and her late husband's emeralds. She was charming, commanding, and effortlessly the center of every conversation. She drew the guests in with anecdotes about the house, about the family's history, about Hadrian's achievements in county politics. She spoke of Thornfield as though it were hers. She spoke of Hadrian as though he were still a boy. She did not mention Evelina once. It was not an oversight. It was an act of theater so polished, so complete, that by the time the dessert course was served, 3 separate guests had mistaken the dowager for the current Duchess. One of them, a Lady Parrish, had turned to Evelina with a pleasant, vacant smile and asked, "And how long have you been in the dowager's household, my dear?" The table went quiet. Not completely, not conspicuously, but with that particular hush that falls when a room full of perceptive people simultaneously realize that something excruciatingly awkward has just occurred. Evelina looked at the woman. She could feel Lady Sabine's gaze on her from the far end of the table, sharp and watchful, waiting to see how she would respond. She could feel Hadrian's eyes too, a different quality of attention, heavier and more uncertain. She smiled. "I am the Duchess of Thornfield," she said, her voice perfectly even, perfectly pleasant, carrying just enough warmth to make the correction feel like a kindness rather than a rebuke, "and you must be Lady Parrish. I have heard such wonderful things about your gardens at Bexhill." The moment passed, the conversation resumed. Lady Parrish flushed crimson and immediately began talking about her roses with the desperate energy of a woman trying to bury her own mistake. The evening continued, smooth and glittering and terrible. Later, after the guests had gone, Evelina stood in her dressing room and removed the paste sapphires from her neck. Her fingers found the clasp of the one piece of jewelry she had not sold, the small cameo locket that hung on a thin gold chain beneath her gown, hidden against her skin. It was her mother's. Her father had given it to her the week before he died, pressing it into her hand with a grip that was already losing its strength. "Keep this," he had said. "It was the thing she loved most, after you." Evelina held the locket in her palm. It was warm from her body. Inside was a tiny portrait of her mother's face, painted in miniature, the brushstrokes so fine they might have been made by a single eyelash. It was the last real thing she owned. Quote, she placed it on the dressing table. In the morning, she would send it to the agent in the city. There was a creditor in the north of the county who was growing impatient, and impatient creditors talked. If he talked, Croyd would hear. If Croyd heard, he would know someone was paying debts that should not exist. She could not afford that. Not now. She looked at the locket one last time, then closed the drawer. Hadrian had not intended to stay at the dinner. He had planned to excuse himself early, as he often did, retreating to the library under the comfortable pretense of urgent estate business. But something had held him in his chair. He had watched the evening unfold from his position at the head of the table, his habitual reserve, mistaken for brooding authority, when in truth it was simply the habit of a man who had long since stopped knowing what to say in his own home. He had seen the seating arrangement. He had noted Evelina's placement at the middle of the table, the quiet demotion it represented, and he had felt a flicker of something that might have been discomfort but was too brief to examine before his mother's voice drew him into a conversation about drainage rights along the northern boundary. Then Lady Parrish had made her mistake, and the room had held its breath, and Hadrian had looked at his wife. He had looked at her, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, he had actually seen her. She was sitting very straight, her chin lifted, her gray-green eyes steady. She was not flushed. She was not trembling. She was smiling, and the smile was so composed, so perfectly calibrated that it might have been mistaken for ease. But Hadrian knew her face, or he had known it once. And somewhere beneath the years of distance and neglect and the slow, corrosive work of his own neglect, he recognized what he was seeing. It was not ease. It was armor, the most exquisite, most heartbreaking armor he had ever seen. "I am the Duchess of Thornfield," she had said, and the words, simple and factual, had landed on him with the force of an accusation. She was the Duchess of Thornfield, and he could not remember the last time he had treated her as such. The thought was unwelcome, and so he did what he always did with unwelcome thoughts. He set it aside, There were more pressing matters: the coal lease, the drainage dispute, the letter from his solicitor about the Northern holdings. He would think about Evelina later. There was always later. But the image stayed with him, stubborn and luminous, long after the candles were snuffed and the house fell still. Her face in the candlelight, the paste jewels at her throat, the steady, unbreakable composure of a woman who had long since stopped expecting rescue. He had not noticed the jewels were paste, but something about them had nagged at him all evening, a quality of light that was not quite right, a coldness in the sparkle that real stones did not possess. He had dismissed it. He dismissed most things about Evelina these days, filing them in the vast, unexamined drawer of his conscience labeled later. But lying in his bed, staring at the canopy above him, the nagging returned. It was joined by other small details he had collected without meaning to, the way a man walking through a field might pick up burrs on his trousers without noticing until he sits down. The flowers in the morning room. Evelina had always kept the house filled with flowers. When had they stopped? The orchids. She still tended them, alone, in the glass house. He had passed the door once last week and seen her through the clouded glass, bending over a pot, her hands dark with soil. She had looked up and their eyes had met through the glass, and for a moment, just a moment, he had seen something in her face that he could not name. Then she had looked away and he had walked on, the child. The mute, strange child, who followed Evelina through the house like a small, solemn shadow. He had agreed to send her to the parish. He had not thought about it since. Had the child gone, he did not know. He did not. He realized with a sudden uncomfortable clarity, know very much about what happened in his own house when it did not directly concern his desk or his diary. A memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. Their first winter at Thornfield, 2 months after the wedding. A snowstorm had sealed the house for 3 days. His mother had not yet begun her campaign. The staff were still adjusting to the new Duchess. And he and Evelina had spent those 3 days in the library, reading aloud to each other, arguing about history, laughing at the wind that screamed against the windows. She had looked up from her book, firelight in her hair, and said, "This is what I imagined it would be." "What?" he had asked. "Being your wife, belonging somewhere." He turned over in bed, pressing his face into the pillow. The memory was a blade, and he was not in the habit of letting himself be cut. He would think about it later. There was sleep when it finally came was shallow and troubled, and in the morning he remembered none of his dreams, only a feeling, formless and insistent, that something precious was slipping through his fingers, and he had not yet thought to close his hand. The kitchen garden at the eastern edge of the estate was the one place Lady Sabine never visited. It was too plain, too practical, too far from the elegant rooms where power was exercised and impressions were managed. It smelled of damp earth and rosemary and the last stubborn herbs of autumn. It was, for that reason, one of the few places at Thornfield where Evelina could still breathe. She had come there on a cold afternoon with Lark beside her, the child's small hand curled inside her own. She was not gardening, she was thinking, trying to think. The walls were closing in, Croyd's locked study door. Sabine's decree about Lark, the dwindling funds, the crushing, endless solitude of a marriage that existed only on paper. She did not hear the old man approach until his shadow fell across the path. Aldous Hearn had been the head gardener at Thornfield for more than 40 years. He had served the 5th Duke, the 6th, and now, nominally, the 7th, though Hadrian rarely consulted him, and Croyd had been trying to pension him off for years. He was a tall man, slightly stooped, with hands like knotted oak roots and a face so deeply lined by weather and time that his expressions seemed carved rather than formed. His eyes, however, were startlingly clear, the pale, sharp blue of a man who had spent a lifetime observing the world from behind a hedge and had missed very little of consequence. "Your Grace," he said, inclining his head. He always addressed her correctly. He was one of the few who still did. "Aldous, she said, and managed to smile. He looked at her for a moment, then at Lark, who had pressed herself against Evelina's side at the stranger's approach. He lowered himself onto the stone bench beside the herb beds, with the slow deliberation of a man whose joints had long since ceased to cooperate with his intentions. "The boy does not see you," he said. It was not a question, and it was the first time anyone at Thornfield had spoken to her about her marriage with anything approaching directness. Evelina's breath caught. She could have deflected. She could have offered one of the careful, diplomatic answers she had perfected since her wedding day. Instead, exhaustion won. "No," she said quietly. "He does not." Aldous nodded, as if she had confirmed something he had known for a long time. "I served his father for 30 years, he said. "The old Duke was not a warm man, but he had one quality that the boy has not yet learned. He knew how to pay attention. When a tree is sick, Your Grace, you do not wait for it to fall. You look at the roots. The boy looks only at the canopy. He sees what is tall and visible and impressive. He does not look down." Evelina said nothing. Her throat had tightened in a way that made speech dangerous. The old man looked at Lark, who was watching him with her solemn, unblinking gaze. He reached into the pocket of his worn coat and produced a small, slightly bruised apple. He held it out to the child, not with the brisk efficiency of a man performing a kindness, but with the slow, patient offering of someone who understood that trust had to be earned at the pace of the one giving it. Lark looked at Evelina. Evelina nodded. The child reached out and took the apple, then retreated behind Evelina's skirt, clutching it like treasure. Aldous watched this exchange with an expression that was difficult to read. Then he looked back at Evelina. "Your father-in-law asked me once, what made a garden thrive," he said. "I told him what I tell every young fool who picks up a spade. It is not the planting that matters, it is the tending. The daily, invisible, thankless work of tending. Anyone can put a seed in the ground, but only someone who loves the thing more than the labor will stay through the frost and the drought and the blight, day after day, without applause." He paused. "You have been tending this house, Your Grace. I may be old, but I am not blind. I have seen the candles in your window at 3 in the morning. I have seen the worry in your face when you think no one is watching. And I have seen what the boy cannot see because he has not yet learned to look." He rose from the bench slowly, his joints protesting. "But I will tell you what I told his father, and what I would tell him if he had the sense to ask. A gardener who gives everything to a garden that gives nothing back will eventually have nothing left, not even the strength to walk away." He inclined his head again and moved off down the path, his boots crunching on the gravel, leaving Evelina standing in the cold air with his words settling over her like the first frost of winter. Walk away. It was the first time anyone had said it. The first time anyone had given her permission to even think it. And the thought, once planted, took root with a speed that frightened her. Could she? Could she simply leave? The question was absurd. She was the Duchess of Thornfield. She had a duty, a position, a name that was no longer even hers, but belonged to the house and the title and the man who bore it. Leaving would be a scandal. It would be a surrender. It would be the final proof of everything Lady Sabine had always believed about her, that she was not equal to the role, that she did not belong, but staying. Staying was killing her. And the worst part, the part that Aldous had seen so clearly from behind his hedge, was that she was dying in service to a man who would not notice she was gone, until someone pointed out the empty chair. The argument, when it came, was not the grand dramatic confrontation that Evelina might once have imagined. It was a small thing, a quiet, ordinary cruelty on a Tuesday evening that broke the last thread, holding her in place. She had gone to the library after dinner. Hadrian was at his desk working by lamplight, a cup of cold tea untouched at his elbow. She had rehearsed the words all day. Not the full truth, not yet, but a beginning, An opening. A single hand extended across the vast, cold distance between them. "Hadrian," she said from the doorway, "I need to speak with you about Lark." He did not look up from his papers. "The child. I thought that matter was settled." "Your mother intends to send her to the parish workhouse. She is 7 years old. She has no one. She has the parish. That is what it exists for."
"She has us,"
Evelina said, and heard her own voice change, the careful neutrality giving way to something rawer and more honest. "She has me. I brought her here. I promised her she would be safe." Hadrian looked up then. His winter lake eyes were weary, distracted, already calculating the quickest route back to his papers. "Avelina," he said, and the way he said her name, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with a patience so worn thin it had become indistinguishable from indifference, was worse than any shout. "You cannot save every stray that wanders onto the estate. My mother is right. The child needs proper care we are not equipped to provide. Let Croyd handle it." She looked at him. She looked at this man she had married, this man she had loved, this man whose house she had saved, and whose debts she had paid, and whose legacy she had protected while he slept a single wall away, unreachable behind a door he had locked against her, and she felt the last thread snap. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was quiet, a small interior sound, like a harp string breaking in an empty room. "Is there anything else?" he asked, already looking back at his desk. "No," she said. "There is nothing else." She turned and left the room. Her footsteps were steady, measured, unhurried. She did not cry. She had no tears left. She had spent them all on worthier things. Behind her, in the library, she heard his mother's voice. Sabine had been in the corridor, waiting. She entered the library as Avelina left it, the way she always did, filling the space that Avelina vacated as naturally as water fills a hole. She heard Lady Sabine say something low and dismissive about sentimentality and parish obligations. She heard Hadrian's voice, tired and resigned, and then she heard the words, "She will forgive me. She always does." Avelina stopped in the corridor. She stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the cold stone wall. The words reached her with a clarity that was almost physical, each one a small, precise blow to a structure that had already collapsed. She always does. She closed her eyes. She breathed in. She breathed out. Then she walked upstairs. She went to Lark's room and woke the child gently, pressing a finger to her own lips. She helped Lark into her coat and shoes. She took the child's hand. She went to her own dressing room. She did not pack a trunk. She did not take a single gown, a single book, a single keepsake. She took the small purse of coins she kept in her bedside drawer, the last pitiful remnant of her dowry. She placed her wedding ring on the dressing table. She sat down at her writing desk and composed a letter. It was short. She did not waste words on accusation or self-pity. She told him where to find the writing case. She told him to look at the accounts. She told him the truth about Croyd. And she wrote a single line at the end that contained everything she could no longer say aloud. "I did not leave because I stopped loving you. I left because you stopped seeing me, and I could not bear to become invisible." She sealed the letter, placed it beside the ring, and looked around the room one final time. Then she took Lark's hand and they walked through the sleeping house, through the servants' entrance, and out into the cold, black, starless night. By morning, the Duchess of Thornfield was gone. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any new stories. The maid who brought the morning tea was the first to discover it. She found the Duchess's bed unslept in, the wardrobe closed, the dressing table bare except for a gold ring and a sealed letter. Within minutes, the news had reached the kitchen. Within the hour, it had spread through every corridor, every stairwell, every whispered conversation in the house. The Duchess had left, vanished in the night, taken nothing but the child. Hadrian was in the breakfast room when Bridget came to him. The lady's maid was white-faced and trembling, not with the servile anxiety of a woman reporting a household crisis, but with the cold, barely contained fury of someone who had watched a wrong being committed for 3 years and had finally reached the limit of her restraint. She placed the letter and the ring on the table in front of him. She did not curtsy. She did not lower her eyes. "Her grace is gone, your grace," she said, and walked out. Hadrian stared at the ring. It was a plain gold band, worn thin on the inside from years of daily wear. He picked it up. It was cold. He opened the letter. The first time with confusion, the second with a dawning, sickening comprehension that began in his chest and spread outward until his hands were shaking and the words on the page blurred. The writing case, the false bottom in the wardrobe. "Croyd!" I could not bear to become invisible. Lady Sabine appeared in the doorway. She had heard the commotion and arrived with the alert composure of a general hearing the first cannon of a battle she had anticipated.
"What is this nonsense?"
she said, her gaze sweeping the room and landing on the letter in his hand.
"What has that girl done now?"
"She has left," Hadrian said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and distant, as though it belonged to someone standing in the next room. "Left?" Lady Sabine repeated. She crossed to the table and reached for the letter. Hadrian pulled it back, a reflexive, almost violent motion that startled them both. "Good heavens," his mother said, recovering quickly. "Well, this is dramatic, but not unexpected. She was always fragile. A woman of stronger character would have." "Stop," Hadrian said. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Lady Sabine blinked. In all his years, in all the careful choreography of their relationship, he had never spoken to her like that. Not once. "I need you to leave this room," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, but beneath the control was something new. Something that his mother, for all her acuity, did not immediately recognize because she had never heard it from her son before. It was grief, and it was turning, slowly and terribly, into understanding. Lady Sabine left. She was rattled, though she would never have admitted it. Her exit was not the imperious sweep of a woman in command. It was the tactical retreat of someone who sensed that the ground beneath her was no longer as solid as she had believed. Hadrian went upstairs. He walked into Avelina's dressing room and stood in the doorway, looking at the empty space the way a man looks at the site of a fire after the flames have gone, searching for something recognizable in the ash. The room smelled of her. A faint, clean scent of lavender and the particular warmth of someone who has recently been present. Her hairbrush was on the dresser, a few strands of auburn hair still caught in the bristles. Her slippers were beside the bed. She had left in her shoes, in her coat, and nothing else. He went to the wardrobe. He opened it. Her gowns hung in a neat row, undisturbed. He knelt and felt along the bottom panel. It moved. Beneath it was a leather writing case, brass-clasped, heavy with the weight of its contents. He carried it to the bed and opened it. What he found inside dismantled the world he thought he knew. The shadow accounts came first. 14 months of meticulous records, written in Avelina's clear, precise hand. Every entry was cross-referenced. Every discrepancy was noted. Every false invoice, every phantom tradesman, every diverted sum was documented with a thoroughness that would have impressed a court of law. Then the receipts. A jeweler's agent in the city, acknowledging payment received for 1 pair of sapphire earrings, 1 pearl choker, 1 garnet brooch, 1 diamond and ruby set. The sums were listed. The dates were listed. The descriptions matched, piece by piece. The jewelry he had given her. He looked up from the papers. The paste sapphires. The necklace at dinner. That had caught the light wrong. He had noticed. He had noticed and he had done nothing, because noticing would have required him to ask, and asking would have required him to listen, and listening would have required him to see the woman he had married and reckon with what he had done to her. There was more. Letters from creditors, copies of her replies, negotiated settlements bearing her false signature, a ledger tracking the estate's true debts against Croyd's falsified accounts, a separate page listing the sums she had paid from her own dowry, from her sold jewels, from the cameo locket that had been her mother's, the only inheritance she possessed. She had sold her mother's locket to pay his debts. The total, carefully summed at the bottom of the final page, was staggering. She had spent every penny she had in the world, every object of personal value she possessed, to hold his estate together while he slept behind a locked door, and told his steward that she would come round. She always does. Hadrian sat on the edge of the bed that his wife had not slept in last night, the bed she would never sleep in again, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He did not weep. He was not yet capable of something so honest. Instead, he felt a sensation he had never experienced before, the complete and total collapse of a man's understanding of his own life. He had believed himself a good man, a dutiful man, a man who honored his obligations and met his responsibilities. He had believed that his marriage was merely strained, a temporary distance that would resolve itself in time, because she was patient and he was busy. And there was always, later. There was no later. There was only this: an empty room, a pile of receipts, and the slow, crushing realization that the woman he had ignored had been the only person in his house who was paying attention. The confrontation with Croyd was brief and devastating. Hadrian summoned him with a short written note that gave no indication of what was coming. The steward arrived with his customary self-assurance, a leather folio under his arm, his expression one of professional calm. Hadrian was standing behind his desk. The writing case was open before him. The shadow accounts were spread across the mahogany surface. He did not ask Croyd to sit. "Would you care to explain these?" he said, gesturing to the papers. Croyd looked at the documents. The color left his face in stages, like a tide withdrawing from a shore. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Your Grace, these are... I do not know where these came from. They are clearly fabrications. Someone has been." "They are not fabrications," Hadrian said. His voice was level, precise, stripped of everything except the cold, surgical clarity of a man who has finally opened his eyes. "They are a complete record of your theft from this estate over 15 years. Every false invoice, every phantom contractor, every penny you diverted. They were compiled by my wife, who discovered your fraud 14 months ago and spent every day since then repairing the damage with her own money, her own jewels, and her own hands, while you stood in this room and addressed her as ma'am." Croyd's composure shattered. "Your Grace, I can explain. There were expenses the estate required." "The estate required nothing that you provided," Hadrian said. "You will leave Thornfield today. My solicitor will be in contact regarding restitution. If you are fortunate, I will pursue this as a civil matter. If you test my patience, I will hand these documents to the magistrate and let the law decide what to do with you." His voice dropped. "You stole from my house, you lied to my face, and you helped make the woman who was saving us all feel as though she did not matter. Get out of my sight." Croyd left. He did not speak again. He did not look back. A footman escorted him to the servants' entrance, and within the hour his room had been cleared and his name struck from the household register. Lady Sabine was harder. Hadrian found her in the drawing room, seated in the chair by the fire, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had been waiting. She knew what was coming, or she thought she did. He stood before her and laid out the facts. Croyd's theft, Evelina's discovery, the sold jewels, the shadow accounts, the debts paid from the Duchess's own pocket, the months of solitary, thankless labor that had kept Thornfield from bankruptcy. Lady Sabine listened. Her face did not change. When he had finished, she spoke. "I did not know about Croyd," she said, and Hadrian believed her. Her sins were different. She had not stolen money. She had stolen something harder to quantify and harder to replace. "You did not know about Croyd," Hadrian said, "but you knew what you were doing to her. You knew, and you did not stop. You drove her from this house, Mother. You and I, between us, we drove out the only person who was trying to save it." Lady Sabine's mouth thinned. She was a proud woman, and pride does not surrender easily. She was unsuitable. She began. "She was magnificent," Hadrian said, and his voice broke on the word, a fracture that ran through the syllable like a crack through ice. "She was magnificent, and I was too blind and too comfortable and too willing to let you think for me to see it. That is my failing, not hers. But you saw her clearly. You saw her strength and her grace and her goodness, and you decided those things were threats. You punished her for being better than you expected her to be. The silence that followed was vast. Lady Sabine did not weep. She did not apologize. But something in her face shifted, a minute alteration around the eyes and mouth that looked, for the first time in Hadrian's memory, like uncertainty. "I will go to the Dower House," she said at last. Her voice was smaller than he had ever heard it. "Yes," Hadrian said, "you will. And you will stay there until I decide otherwise." He did not say more. There was no satisfaction in it. There was only the bleak, exhausted clarity of a man who had finally stopped looking at the canopy and had turned his gaze to the roots and found them rotted. He did not go after her, not that day and not the next. He wanted to. Every hour, every minute, the urge to saddle a horse and ride burned in him like a coal pressed against his ribs. But something held him in place, something that was not indecision, but its opposite. A terrible, necessary reckoning with himself that could not be rushed and could not be avoided. He spent the first night in the library, sitting in the chair where he had dismissed her for the last time. He did not light a lamp. He sat in the darkness and he made himself remember. Not the grand moments, not the wedding or the early days of courtship, but the small ones, the ones he had failed to notice. The cup of tea she placed on his desk every afternoon without being asked, the way she always ensured his favorite marmalade was stocked, even when the household budget was tight, and he had never once wondered why the budget was tight. The sound of her footsteps in the corridor outside the library, hesitating, then moving on, because she had learned that a closed door meant she was not welcome. How many times had she paused outside that door? How many times had she wanted to speak to him, to tell him about Croyd, about the debts, about the loneliness that was swallowing her whole, and had turned away because she knew he would not listen. He did not sleep. He did not eat. The household moved around him in a state of subdued panic. The Duchess was gone. The steward had been dismissed. The Dowager had retreated to the Dower House. The Duke sat alone in the dark library and spoke to no one. On the second day, Bridget came to him again. She stood in the doorway, her arms folded, her expression that of a woman who had exhausted her supply of deference and was now operating on something harder and more durable. "Are you going to sit in this chair until you become part of it?" she asked. "Or are you going to go and find her?" He looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed. His jaw was dark with stubble. He looked for the first time since she had known him, like a man rather than a duke. Where would she go? He asked. Bridget studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether he deserved the answer. "Her father's old colleague," she said at last. "Dr. Ashley. He lives in Hartbridge near the coast. It is the only place she ever spoke of with any warmth besides this house." And she stopped. "Up. Speaking of this house with warmth a long time ago," he nodded. He rose from the chair. His legs were stiff, his body aching from 2 days of sitting in the cold room without food or rest. He moved toward the door. "Your Grace," Bridget said. He stopped. She paused a long time before she spoke again. She sold her mother's locket, the only thing she had left of her. She sold it to pay a creditor who was threatening to expose the debts, because if he had, Mr. Croyd would have known someone was undoing his work, and the whole thing would have collapsed. She did that for you. And you told Mr. Croyd that she would come round. The words landed where they were meant to. Hadrian said nothing. He went to the stables, saddled his own horse because he could not bear to speak to the groom, and rode out into the gray morning. Hartbridge was 50 miles east on the coast. A small, wind-scoured settlement of fishermen and farmers, the kind of place where a woman with a child and a handful of coins could disappear into the ordinary rhythms of a life that asked nothing of her but the work of her hands. He rode hard, stopping only to water the horse. He did not eat. He did not rest. The road unwound before him, mile after mile of moorland, giving way to farmland, giving way to the salt-scoured flats near the sea. And with every mile, the sentences he composed in his mind collapsed under the weight of their own inadequacy. What words could undo what he had done? What apology could repay what she had given? He had no answer. He had only the road and the horse beneath him, and the growing, terrible conviction that he might arrive to find she did not want to see him, and that if she did not, he would deserve it. He reached Hartbridge as the afternoon light was fading. The village was small, a huddle of stone cottages along a single muddy lane that ended at the gray, restless sea. He asked at the inn. The innkeeper, a weathered woman with suspicious eyes, regarded him with the particular wariness that remote communities reserve for strangers who arrive on lathered horses asking questions. "A woman," he said, "with a child. A little girl who does not speak." The innkeeper studied him for a long moment. Then she pointed up the lane toward a small cottage set apart from the others, half hidden behind a low stone wall and a tangle of wild roses that had not yet surrendered to the coming winter. He dismounted. He tied the horse to the gate. He walked up the path. The cottage, he would learn later, belonged to Dr. Ashley, who had given Evelina and Lark shelter without question when they arrived exhausted and shivering 2 days earlier. The old physician had known her father. He had taken one look at her face and asked nothing except whether she was hungry and whether the child needed a bed. He had given them this cottage, which stood empty between tenants, and had brought them clothes and food, and the promise of work if she wanted it. He had also, with the instinctive protectiveness of a man who understood what it meant to lose everything, told no one in the village her real name. The door was open. Through it, he could see a small, plain room, whitewashed walls, a scrubbed wooden table, a fire burning low in the grate, and there, sitting at the table with a slate in front of her, drawing with a piece of chalk, was Lark. The child looked up. Her dark eyes widened. She did not move. She did not make a sound. But her gaze went past him, through the doorway, to the lane beyond, as if checking to see if he had brought the world she feared with him. Then Evelina appeared from the back room. She was wearing a plain dress of brown wool, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, her feet bare on the stone floor. She looked thinner. She looked tired. She looked, in the low amber light of the afternoon, more beautiful and more formidable than he had ever seen her. She saw him. She stopped. The silence between them was not the frozen waste of Thornfield. It was something rawer and more honest, the silence of two people standing on either side of a chasm, both knowing that words alone cannot build a bridge, but that someone has to try. "Evelina," he said. She did not move. Her gray-green eyes were steady, watchful, and utterly without pretense. She was not going to make this easy for him. She was not going to come round. She was never going to come round again. "I found the writing case," he said. "I found everything. I know what you did. I know what Croyd did. I know what I did, and I know what my mother did." She said nothing. He took a breath. It was the hardest breath of his life. He had commanded rooms, commanded estates, commanded the attention of powerful men, but he had never done what he was about to do, which was to stand before a woman he had failed and offer her not an excuse, not a justification, not a plan, but the bare, undefended truth of his own inadequacy. "I told Croyd you would forgive me," he said. "I told him you always did, and I believed it. I believe your patience was something I was owed, like the rents, like the house, like the air I breathed. I did not earn it. I did not honor it. I spent it like a man spending coins he thinks will never run out. And when the purse was empty, I did not even have the grace to notice." His voice was unsteady now, cracking along fault lines he had not known existed. "You saved my house. You saved my name. You sold your mother's locket to keep a creditor quiet. And I did not know, because I never asked. I never asked you anything. Not how you were, not what you needed, not whether you were happy. I locked a door between us and called it practicality. And every night you sat on the other side of it, alone, doing the work I should have been doing. And I did not see you." He stopped. He looked at her, and his eyes, his pale winter lake eyes, were no longer cold or distant or unreadable. They were filled with something she had not seen in them for a very long time. 3 years, an entire marriage, a lifetime. "I cannot undo what I have done," he said. "I cannot give you back the jewels or the locket or the years. I cannot promise to be the man you married because that man was arrogant and blind and did not deserve you. But I can promise you this. I will never again fail to see you. I will never again mistake your silence for contentment. And I will spend every day I have left earning what I once assumed was mine by right." He reached into his coat. He produced the writing case. He held it out to her. "This belongs to you," he said, "everything in it. The proof, the accounts, the truth. It is yours. It was always yours. And so is Thornfield if you will have it. Not as my mother's house. Our home. If you can find it in yourself to give me one more chance, not because you always do, but because I have finally given you a reason to." Evelina looked at the case. She looked at the man holding it. She did not speak for a long time. Then Lark moved. The child slipped down from her chair, crossed the room, and stood in front of Hadrian. She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face with the grave, unblinking intensity of a child who has learned to read people, the way others read books, not for what they say, but for what they mean. She reached up and placed her small palm flat against his chest, over his heart. The same gesture she used with Evelina. The silent question. The test. Hadrian stood very still. He did not move. He did not breathe. He looked down at the child he had dismissed as not his responsibility, the child his mother had called a stray, the child his wife had loved enough to take with her into the unknown. And Lark opened her mouth. And for the first time in more than a year, in a voice small and rough with disuse, barely louder than the sound of the sea through the open door, she spoke. "Stay," she said. It was one word, one syllable, but it broke something open in the room, in the man, in the woman watching from the doorway, that all the speeches and apologies and grand gestures in the world could not have touched. Evelina's composure, the magnificent, unbreakable armor she had worn since the day she arrived at Thornfield, finally cracked. The tears came, not the silent, controlled tears of a woman managing her grief, but the deep, shuddering release of someone who has carried a weight so long she had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. She crossed the room. She did not run. She walked as she had always walked, with the quiet, measured dignity that was the truest expression of who she was. She took the writing case from his hands and set it on the table. And then she placed her hands on either side of his face the way she used to, in the early days when his face was still the landscape she most wanted to learn. "Do not make me invisible again," she said. Her voice was steady even through the tears. "Do not lock doors. Do not defer to your mother when you should be listening to your wife. Do not tell anyone that I will come round. I am not a season. I am not a tide. I am a person, and I chose you, and you must choose me back. Every day, not once. Every day, he said. And he meant it with a ferocity that surprised even himself, because he had finally understood what Aldous had told him without telling him, what Bridget had shown him without showing him, what the child's single syllable had cracked open in his chest. Love was not a thing you were given, it was a thing you tended. Daily, invisible, thankless. And the moment you stopped tending it, you did not lose it all at once. You lost it the way Evelina had lost her jewels, piece by piece, sail by sail, until the only thing left was paste and the memory of what had once been real. He would not let it happen again, not to her, not to the child whose hand was still pressed against his heart, not to the house that she had saved with her own bare, chapped, magnificent hands. He took her hands from his face and held them. Then he did something he had not done in 3 years. He lifted them to his lips and kissed them, one and then the other, slowly, with the deliberate tenderness of a man who has finally learned that the smallest gestures are the ones that matter most. Outside, the sea moved against the shore in its ancient patient rhythm. Inside, the fire crackled. Lark, standing between them, reached up and took one of Evelina's hands and one of Hadrian's, so that the three of them were joined in a small, uneven circle in the middle of a borrowed kitchen, in a village at the edge of the world. It was not Thornfield, it was not grand or impressive or built to endure for centuries, but it was, in that moment, the most honest room Hadrian had ever stood in, and the woman before him was the most extraordinary person he had ever known, and the child between them was the bravest creature he had ever met. And he understood at last that these were the things that mattered, not the house, not the title, not the legacy carved in stone, the tending, the daily, invisible, sacred work of tending. They returned to Thornfield a week later, not in a black lacquered carriage with matched grays, but in a hired cart, the three of them sitting together on the bench seat, Lark wedged between them, the writing case on Evelina's lap. The house looked different to her as they approached, not smaller, not less imposing, but changed in the way that a familiar face changes when you have been away long enough to see it with fresh eyes. The gray stone caught the autumn light. The lake reflected a sky that was for the first time in her memory, unclouded. The moors, which had always seemed to press against the house like a besieging army, looked merely wild, and wildness, she had learned, was not the same as hostility. The staff lined the entrance hall. Bridget was at the front, her face a battlefield of relief and defiance and hard-won joy. She did not curtsy. She took Evelina's hands and held them for a long moment, and the look that passed between the two women said everything that needed to be said and nothing that could have been said aloud. Aldous stood at the back, leaning on his spade, his weathered face creased in a smile he made no effort to hide. As Evelina passed him, he inclined his head, the same respectful greeting he had always given her, the one that had never wavered even when every other person in the house had looked through her as though she were glass. "Wadden is coming along, your grace," he said. "Needed tending while you were gone." She smiled at him and he nodded, and between them passed the understanding of two people who knew exactly what the word tending meant. Lady Sabine was not there. She would remain at the Dower House. In time, much later, there would be a careful, cautious reconciliation, built not on the old hierarchy of dominance and submission, but on the slower, harder foundation of honesty. It would never be warm. But it would be real, and that was more than it had ever been before. Croyd was gone. His replacement, a young woman named Thalia Marsh, appointed on Dr. Ashley's recommendation after the return to Thornfield, arrived within the fortnight. She was sharp, principled, and entirely unimpressed by tradition for its own sake. She and Evelina understood each other immediately. The accounts were opened, the real ones, not Croyd's fictions. Evelina and Thalia worked through them together, side by side in the study that was no longer locked, and the picture they revealed was grim, but not hopeless. The estate was damaged, but it was not dead. With careful management and the restitution that Hadrian's solicitors were pursuing from Croyd, Thornfield would recover. It would take years. It would take patience and discipline and the kind of relentless, unglamorous work that no one writes ballads about, but it would survive. Evelina knew something about that kind of work. The paste jewels were never replaced. Evelina wore them deliberately, openly, as a reminder. When guests complimented the sapphires, she would smile and say, "They are not real." And she would look at Hadrian, and he would look at her, and between them would pass a private, luminous understanding that needed no words. Hadrian himself had changed in ways that were visible only to those who knew where to look. He still rose early. He still worked at his desk for long hours. But the library door was never closed, and in the evenings, instead of retreating into ledgers and solitude, he would sit by the fire while Evelina read and Lark drew on her slate, and the room that had once been a mausoleum of solitude became by slow degrees the living heart of the house. He asked her things now, small things, at first. What she thought about the drainage plans, whether the south field should be planted with barley or left fallow, what color she would like the morning room painted. They were small questions, but each one was an act of seeing, a deliberate turning of attention toward the person he had once allowed to become invisible. And Evelina, who had spent years perfecting the art of not being noticed, allowed herself, slowly and with a caution that would take a long time to fully dissolve, to be seen. Lark did not become a chatterbox. She would never be that. But the single word she had spoken in the cottage was a door that once opened could not be fully closed again. Words came slowly, one or two at a time, offered like rare gifts to the people she trusted. She called Bridget by name. She asked Aldous about his flowers. She said, "Please and thank you to Mrs. Penrose," who wept the first time she heard it and denied it furiously afterward. She began to draw again, not the small cramped pictures she had made on her slate in dark alcoves, but large, confident drawings on sheets of paper that Evelina provided. Horses and trees, and the lake and the moors, and increasingly people. She drew Bridget with her arms folded. She drew Aldous among his roses. She drew Evelina at her desk in the library, surrounded by books. And she drew Hadrian, tall and serious, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at something only he could see. It was the drawing of Hadrian that Evelina found on her pillow one evening, placed there by small, careful hands while she was not looking. She held it up to the lamplight and studied it. The child had captured something true in it. Not the Duke, not the title, not the severity. She had drawn the man underneath, the one who was learning, day by day, how to look down as well as up, how to see what was at his feet as well as what towered above him. Evelina set the drawing on the bedside table and kept it there. It was, in its own way, as valuable as any jewel she had ever owned and far more real. And at night, when the house was still and the moors were silver under the moon, Lark would sometimes climb into the space between Hadrian and Evelina in the wide bed in the master chamber, the bed they shared now with no locked doors between them, and she would press one palm against Evelina's cheek and the other against Hadrian's. And in the warm darkness, she would whisper the word that had started everything, "Stay." And they did.